In 1950, inside a dormitory room in Rockland County, New York, a doctor carried a small vial past rows of sleeping children. None of them had a parent in the room. None of them had a lawyer, an advocate, or a guardian standing by to ask a single question on their behalf. In the eyes of the state, that silence was permission enough. 20 children living inside Letchworth Village were given doses of an experimental vaccine, years before the world would come to know the names Salk and Sabin. No one asked the children if they understood. No one could have. That was the point. And that silence would go on to help end one of the most feared diseases in human history. For most of the 20th century, Letchworth Village was celebrated as something extraordinary. A model institution, a humane alternative to the grim asylums of the 1800s. A farming village of Fieldstone cottages built on the belief that people with disabilities deserved dignity, sunlight, and open land instead of iron bars. Governors praised it. Doctors from across Europe came to study it. For a while, it seemed to prove that reform was possible. But underneath that reputation was a quieter, darker arrangement, one where the very children the institution promised to protect became its most valuable and most voiceless resource. This is the story of Letchworth Village, a dream born from compassion that slowly became something else entirely, and what it cost the people history nearly forgot to name. Chapter 1. The Quaker Who Hated Asylums. Long before the first stone was laid in Rockland County, the story of Letchworth Village begins with one man's discomfort. William Letchworth was not a doctor, politician, nor reformer by trade. He was a businessman, a partner in a Buffalo firm that manufactured saddlery hardware, the iron fittings used in harnesses and saddles, and he had built a considerable fortune through careful, disciplined work. By the standards of his era, he had every reason to spend the rest of his life comfortably enjoying what he had earned. Instead, he chose to walk away from commerce entirely and devote everything that remained of his life to a single uncomfortable question. What happens to the people society decides it no longer wants to look at? Letchworth had been raised in the Quaker tradition, a faith that placed enormous weight on the inherent worth of every human being, regardless of ability, wealth, or social standing. That belief did not stay confined to Sunday mornings. It followed him into almshouses, into asylums, and into the crowded wards where the poor, the elderly, the mentally ill, and children with disabilities were often housed together in the same buildings, sometimes in the same rooms, with little distinction made between them. What Letchworth witnessed inside these institutions disturbed him deeply. Men and women who needed structure, medical attention, or simply a peaceful place to grow older were instead being warehoused alongside desperate strangers, in conditions that offered little comfort and even less hope. In 1873, Letchworth made his decision. He stepped back from business entirely and turned his full attention toward reform. 5 years later, in 1878, he was appointed president of the New York State Board of Charities, a position that gave him real influence over how the state treated its most vulnerable citizens. From that post, Letchworth became one of the most persistent and outspoken critics of the almshouse system in the country. He argued that the era of the high-rise asylum and the county poorhouse needed to end. These buildings had become symbols of neglect rather than care, places where people were stored rather than treated. Letchworth believed there was a better way, and he did not simply propose it in the abstract. On his own estate in western New York, he began to put his philosophy into practice. He believed that healing, dignity, and stability could not be manufactured inside a single towering building surrounded by iron fencing. They required space. They required nature. They required something that felt less like confinement and more like a community. A village where people lived among cottages and open fields rather than corridors and locked wards. This idea was radical for its time. Rather than concentrating hundreds or thousands of residents inside one massive structure, Letchworth proposed a network of smaller homes, each housing a modest number of people, spread across acres of farmland. Residents would not simply exist within these walls. They would work the land, tend animals, grow food, and contribute to a self-sustaining community structured not around punishment or containment, but around purpose and routine. It was a vision decades ahead of the institutional thinking that surrounded it. Letchworth spent years advocating for this model, gathering support, and pushing the state toward action. In 1907, that advocacy finally produced results. New York State formally approved his plan, agreeing to fund and build a facility based on the cottage system he had championed for decades. 2 years later, in 1909, the state secured land in the hamlet of Thiels in Rockland County, setting the stage for what would eventually become Letchworth Village. But William Pryor Letchworth would never see it completed. He died before the first residents ever walked through its gates, before the Fieldstone cottages were finished, before the farmland he imagined was ever planted. The institution that would carry his name, built entirely on his belief that even society's most forgotten people deserve dignity, opened its doors without him. What began as one man's private discomfort with cruelty would soon become one of the most closely watched experiments in the history of American institutional care, and its story was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Building the Village. With the state's approval secured in 1907, the work of turning William Letchworth's vision into something real began in earnest. New York State moved to acquire land in Thiels, a small hamlet in Rockland County, and by 1909, the purchase was complete. What the state now owned was not a modest plot for a single building. It was an enormous stretch of countryside, eventually growing to more than 2,000 acres, later expanding further to over 2,300 acres of rolling fields, woodland, and farmland. For a project meant to house society's most vulnerable citizens, the sheer scale of the land alone signaled something unusual was being attempted. The architecture chosen for the village was deliberate, almost symbolic in its intent. Rather than the imposing stone fortresses associated with asylums of the era, the buildings at Letchworth were modeled after Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's own estate. It was an audacious visual choice. These were not meant to look like places of confinement. They were meant to look like homes built from local fieldstone and designed to let in abundant natural light. Even the infrastructure reflected this philosophy. Power lines and phone lines were buried beneath the ground rather than strung overhead, removing the visual clutter that marked so many institutional campuses of the time. From a distance, Letchworth Village was meant to resemble a peaceful American town, not a facility. The guiding principles behind the village's design came directly from the cottage plan Letchworth had spent decades advocating for. Dormitories were restricted to no more than 2 stories, a strict limit meant to avoid the towering, impersonal scale of the asylums he had spent his career condemning. Each dormitory building was designed to house between 16 and 70 residents, subdivided further into smaller, more intimate living groups rather than one undifferentiated mass of patients. Buildings were required to be spaced at least 200 feet apart from one another, ensuring that no single structure dominated the landscape and that residents had genuine physical space between living quarters. Every dormitory was also required to have its own attached playground, at minimum equipped with a basketball court, a detail that underscored just how seriously the planners took the idea that this population deserved recreation, not merely shelter. Separate living and training facilities were constructed for children, for able-bodied adults, and for the infirm, allowing each group access to spaces suited to their specific needs rather than forcing vastly different populations into identical conditions. Beyond the dormitories themselves, the campus was designed to be almost entirely self-sufficient. Plans called for a hospital, laboratory, dining halls, and staff housing, alongside a gymnasium, theater, Sunday school, firehouse, boiler house, laundry facilities, refrigeration plant, bakery, storehouses, workshops, and administrative offices. Letchworth Village was not simply a residence. It was intended to function as a fully operating small town, complete with the institutions any town would need to sustain itself. The scope of construction was immense, and it did not happen instantly. Building continued in phases as the campus grew from an ambitious blueprint into a functioning community. By the end of 1911, the first phase of construction had been completed. On July 10, 1911, the first residents were formally admitted. For the man who had spent nearly 4 decades fighting to change how America treated its most vulnerable citizens, it was the culmination of a lifelong campaign, even though he himself had not lived to see the gates open. Leadership of the new institution fell to Dr. Charles Sherman Little, a psychiatrist appointed as superintendent, tasked with translating Letchworth's philosophy into the daily operation of an institution unlike almost anything else in the country. At its founding, Letchworth Village represented something genuinely new in American institutional care, an attempt to replace confinement with community and neglect with structured purpose. It would eventually grow to encompass more than 130 separate buildings, designed to care for as many as 3,000 residents. For a brief, hopeful period, it seemed as though the experiment might actually succeed. What no one fully anticipated was how quickly the ambitions behind that success would begin to outgrow the reality built to sustain them. Chapter 3: The Golden Years. For roughly 2 decades after its opening, Letchworth Village functioned much closer to the dream William had spent his life imagining than to the grim caricature. Visitors who walked the grounds during this period did not find dark corridors or locked wards. They found working farmland, orchards, and pastures, tended in large part by the residents themselves. Letchworth Village was designed to be self-sustaining, and for a significant stretch of its early history, it genuinely was. Residents grew their own crops, raised cows, pigs, and chickens, and produced enough food to help feed the population living on campus. This was not simply a way to occupy the residents' time. It was framed as meaningful, purposeful labor, work that gave structure and dignity to daily life, rather than treating residents as passive recipients of care. Beyond farming, residents were trained in practical trades that could serve them for a lifetime. Vocational programs taught carpentry, shoe repair, welding, sewing, and cooking, skills that gave many residents a genuine sense of accomplishment and capability. Around the Christmas season, residents crafted toys by hand, which were then sold to the surrounding community. A small but symbolically significant detail that suggested a place where residents were seen as contributors rather than burdens. The village even developed its own economy of sorts, complete with its own power plant supplying electricity to the sprawling campus, ensuring that Letchworth operated with a level of self-sufficiency few institutions of its size could claim. The reputation Letchworth built during these years extended far beyond Rockland County. Under the direction of Dr. Charles Little, the village became a genuine center of research into the causes and treatment of intellectual disability, drawing physicians and specialists from across the United States and Europe who came specifically to study its methods. Courses were offered to visiting doctors, turning Letchworth into something resembling a teaching institution as much as a residential one. Financial and institutional support strengthened this reputation considerably when Mary Harriman, wife of railroad tycoon Edward Henry Harriman, joined the village's board in 1913. Her involvement brought both funding and prestige, helping support researchers and physicians, and eventually lending her family's name to a building honoring Dr. Little's chief researcher, Dr. George Jervis, a name that would later resurface in a far more complicated chapter of the village's history. Economically, Letchworth Village became one of the most significant institutions in the entire region. At its peak, the campus employed approximately 10,000 people drawn from the surrounding towns, making it not just a residential facility, but one of the largest employers in the area. It was said that almost every family in North Rockland had some connection to the village. Entire careers were built inside its walls, sometimes across generations of the same family. For many local residents, the village was less an institution to be feared and more a familiar, almost beloved fixture of daily life. A place where the people living there were regarded as recognizable members of the wider community, rather than strangers hidden behind walls. By every outward measure, Letchworth Village had accomplished what it set out to do, replacing the towering, impersonal asylum with something that felt like an actual town. Newspapers, state officials, and visiting professionals took notice, and their praise was not faint. But beneath this celebrated exterior, the foundations of the village's later unraveling were already quietly forming. The very success that made Letchworth famous also made it desirable. As word spread of its progressive reputation, the demand to admit new residents grew steadily, straining a campus that had been carefully designed around strict limits on space and population. The village had been built with precise boundaries in mind, a specific number of buildings, beds, and vision of scale. What no one had fully accounted for was what would happen once that vision collided with a system that kept sending more people than it was ever built to hold. Chapter 4: Sorting Souls. To understand what happened next inside Letchworth Village, it is necessary to understand how the medical establishment of the period thought about disability itself, and how those beliefs directly shaped who was allowed through the village's gates in the first place. In 1921, Dr. Charles Little, the village's superintendent, submitted an annual report in which he organized residents into a formal classification system. That system relied on clinical terminology considered medically standard at the time, language that grouped people according to perceived intellectual capability. Modern medicine has long since abandoned these terms. They reveal how deeply institutional thinking of the era was shaped by ideas of usefulness, hierarchy, and control, ideas that would go on to directly determine who received care and who did not. Dr. Little's report explained that individuals in what he classified as the most severely disabled category should not be admitted to Letchworth at all, on the grounds that they lacked the capacity to be trained and could not benefit the state. It is a striking phrase, and worth sitting with for a moment. Admission to a facility built on the promise of humane care was not determined solely by need. It was determined by output. Male residents considered capable of labor were assigned to jobs that included loading thousands of tons of coal into storage facilities, building roads, and farming the village's extensive acreage. The able-bodied were not simply permitted to work, they were expected to, and that expectation shaped who the institution considered worth taking in. This was not unique to Letchworth. It reflected a broader current running through American medicine and social policy during the early 20th century, a period when eugenic thinking, the belief that certain traits and populations were more or less valuable to society, held significant influence over public institutions, immigration policy, and medical practice alike. Letchworth Village did not invent this thinking. It operated within it, absorbing the assumptions of its era, even as it tried to be genuinely humane. The consequences of this framework became especially visible in how the village treated its youngest residents. Many of those admitted to Letchworth were children, and the numbers revealed just how significant that population was. According to the 13th annual report, filed in 1921, out of 506 people admitted that year, 317 were between the ages of 5 and 16, and 11 were under the age of 5. Visitors during this period observed that many of these children appeared malnourished and unwell. Staff at the time attributed this to a scarcity of food, water, and basic supplies, though later accounts would suggest that explanation did not tell the whole story. Some of these same children were capable of learning and engaging meaningfully with education, but were denied that opportunity simply because they had already been categorized as fundamentally different, a label that was rarely revisited. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath Letchworth's celebrated architecture and progressive reputation. Even as the village offered fieldstone cottages instead of iron bars, it was still operating inside a medical culture that sorted human beings by perceived value, and that sorting had real consequences for who was cared for, who was educated, and who was simply overlooked. The village's founders had set out to replace cruelty with compassion. What they had not fully escaped was a deeper, more insidious assumption, that some lives were simply worth more institutional attention than others. That assumption would not stay confined to admission policies and annual reports. As the population inside Letchworth Village continued to swell far beyond what its founders had ever designed it to hold, the same logic that determined who deserved training and who did not would eventually extend into far more consequential territory, shaping decisions about which residents' bodies could be used without anyone ever having to ask their permission. Chapter 5: Cracks in the Model. The strain on Letchworth Village did not appear suddenly. It built slowly until a facility designed around careful limits found itself buckling under a population it was never built to hold. By 1935, Letchworth had reached the ceiling its planners had originally set: 3,000 residents, the exact number the campus had been designed to comfortably support. in an institution built on the belief that space, privacy, and small living groups were essential to humane care. Reaching that number should have triggered a pause, a moment to consolidate and protect what had already been built. Instead, it became the moment the village's carefully designed limits started to collapse. New residents kept arriving. Some came from other overcrowded state institutions, sent to Letchworth specifically because it had a reputation as one of the finest facilities of its kind, without much consideration for whether it actually had room to receive them. Families played a significant and often overlooked role in the growing crisis. Many relatives who placed loved ones in Letchworth's care simply stopped visiting, writing, and never returned at all. Later accounts from state officials would describe this pattern plainly. Families abandoned relatives at the village, leaving the institution to absorb not just their care, but the full weight of decisions no one else was willing to make. The state's response to this mounting pressure was largely inadequate. Despite repeated requests for additional funding to expand the campus, construct new buildings, and hire more staff, meaningful support was slow to arrive and often insufficient when it did. The rigid founding guidelines that had once defined Letchworth, small dormitories, strict population caps, generous space between buildings, began to erode simply because there was nowhere else to put people. Buildings never intended to function as dormitories were pressed into service as such. Structures designed to house a modest, manageable number of residents were pressed to hold far more than their original blueprints allowed. A single external event made an already difficult situation significantly worse. During the 1940s, the state had begun constructing an entirely new facility, Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, specifically intended to relieve overcrowding at Letchworth and other similar institutions across New York. It should have offered exactly the kind of relief the village desperately needed. Instead, when the United States entered the Second World War, the newly built Willowbrook campus was turned over to the United States Army before it ever admitted a single one of its originally intended patients. The facility meant to ease Letchworth's burden became unavailable at precisely the moment that burden was becoming unbearable, leaving thousands of residents crowded into a campus that had already exceeded its limits years earlier. By the visible measures available at the time, the consequences of this overcrowding were becoming difficult to ignore. Visitors and staff alike began noting conditions that stood in sharp contrast to the village's founding ideals. Dormitories holding far more residents than their design ever intended, buildings straining under populations several times their original capacity. What had been conceived as an intimate network of small cottage homes was steadily transforming into something closer to the very institutions William Pryor Letchworth had spent his life trying to replace. None of this happened through any single decision, scandal, or failure. It happened gradually, through a slow accumulation of transfers, abandonments, funding shortfalls, and one significant wartime setback, each compounding the last. By the time these cracks became visible enough for outsiders to notice, Letchworth Village had already drifted far from the vision that built it. And within this widening gap between founding ideal and daily reality, in an institution now defined as much by overcrowding as by ambition, a decision would soon be made that would use the bodies of the village's most vulnerable residents in ways the state was never required to explain. Chapter 6: The Children Who Could Not Refuse. By the middle of the 20th century, polio stood as one of the most feared diseases in the world. It struck without warning, disproportionately affected children, and could leave survivors paralyzed for life. Parents across the country dreaded summer, the season when outbreaks tended to spike, and entire communities lived under the constant anxiety of a threat no one fully understood how to stop. Researchers everywhere were racing to find a vaccine, and that race would eventually lead indirectly to a dormitory inside Letchworth Village. In February of 1950, Dr. George Jervis, a researcher affiliated with the village, reached out to virologist Dr. Hilary Kaprowski. Jervis wanted Kaprowski to test an early live virus polio vaccine on residents at Letchworth, comparing its effectiveness against other approaches being developed at the time. Kaprowski had already tested the vaccine on himself and a laboratory assistant 2 years earlier. Now he was being asked to test it on children who could not meaningfully consent and who had no parent or guardian in the room advocating on their behalf. 20 children living at Letchworth Village were ultimately used in the trial, chosen not because they volunteered, but because they were residents of an institution with no legal obligation to ask for their consent, or anyone else's, before proceeding. Kaprowski and Jervis considered the trial a meaningful step toward a safer, more effective vaccine, and by the standards of their profession at the time, it was treated as a success. No one involved in the research treated this as anything other than routine scientific progress. There was no legal requirement in 1950 for the kind of informed consent modern medicine now considers foundational to any human research. Institutionalized children, like those at Letchworth, existed in a kind of legal blind spot, technically under the state's care, yet without any meaningful individual advocate position to ask whether this was something that should happen to them, or to explain to them in any way what was taking place. Their families were not positioned to intervene even if they had known. The very overcrowding and neglect chronicled in the years before this trial had already stripped many of these children of visible individual identity within the institution. They were, in the coldest bureaucratic sense, available. This was not an isolated failure unique to Letchworth Village. It reflected a much broader pattern that ran through American medicine for much of the 20th century. People in psychiatric hospitals, prisons, and residential facilities for the disabled were treated as convenient and accessible subjects for research precisely because they had so little power to refuse. In the years that followed, other institutions would face far more severe reckonings for similar practices. Willowbrook State School on Staten Island would later become infamous for a separate set of hepatitis studies conducted on children living there, research that would go on to become one of the defining case studies in the history of American medical ethics. Letchworth's polio trial belongs to that same troubling era, a period when the line between medical progress and exploitation was drawn far too faintly, if it was drawn at all. What makes this chapter of the village's history so difficult to sit with is not any singular act of cruelty. No one involved set out to harm these children, and by the clinical record, none of them were harmed. What makes it difficult is the structure itself, an institution that had positioned itself as a humane alternative to cold, uncaring asylums, making decisions behind closed doors about the bodies of its most voiceless residents without any obligation to ask their permission, because the law simply did not require it to. That gap between what was legal and what was right would not remain unexamined forever. The very absence of consent that made trials like this possible at Letchworth would eventually become impossible to ignore, feeding directly into a broader national reckoning over how research on vulnerable populations should be conducted, and who should have the power to say no. In the decades that followed, that reckoning would produce sweeping reforms, new federal protections, and an entirely new standard for informed consent, one built specifically because places like Letchworth Village had shown what happens when that standard does not exist. Chapter 7. Behind the Fieldstone Walls. For years, the public image of Letchworth Village remained largely untouched by what was actually happening inside its dormitories. The Fieldstone cottages, working farmland, vocational workshops, all of it continued to project the same reassuring picture the village had cultivated since its founding. But that picture depended almost entirely on who was allowed to see it, and for how long. Behind the buildings, visitors were shown a very different daily reality that had been taking shape for years, one that would eventually prove impossible to keep hidden. The first significant crack in that public image appeared in the 1940s, when photojournalist Irving Haberman gained access to the village and documented what he found. His photographs showed residents without adequate clothing or bathing, visibly neglected, some sleeping directly on bare mattresses laid out on the floor of overcrowded rooms. These were not staged or exaggerated images. They were a direct visual record of conditions that stood in stark contrast to everything the village's polished reputation had promised. Until Haberman's photographs circulated, the broader public had little reason to question what was happening behind Letchworth's carefully maintained exterior. His work forced that question into the open for the first time, revealing that the gap between the institution's founding ideals and its daily operation had grown far wider than anyone outside its walls had realized. The reports that followed painted a consistent picture. Visitors and officials described children who appeared malnourished and unwell, conditions that staff attributed to a scarcity of food, water, and basic supplies, even though later scrutiny would suggest that scarcity was not the full explanation. Overcrowding only intensified the strain on every part of daily life at the village. By the 1950s, the population had swelled to roughly 4,000 residents, and by the late 1960s, it had climbed past 5,000, numbers that dwarfed the 3,000 the campus had originally been designed to hold. Dormitories built to comfortably house a modest number of residents were now regularly packed with 70 beds crammed into spaces never intended to hold that many people. Neglect was not the only documented failure inside the village during these years. Records and later accounts also described instances of abuse among residents themselves, as well as cases of staff members being mistreated by their co-workers. In an institution stretched this thin, understaffed, and overextended, the kind of close supervision necessary to prevent this sort of harm simply was not consistently possible, and for a long time, very little of it reached the outside world. Many former employees who worked at Letchworth during these decades have remained reluctant to discuss their experiences even long after the village closed, a silence that speaks to just how difficult and complicated this period of the institution's history actually was. It would be inaccurate to reduce Letchworth Village during these years to nothing but cruelty and neglect. Former staff members who worked there have described a very different personal experience, one defined by genuine warmth and connection. Some who worked in its dining halls and dormitories recalled residents as familiar, beloved figures within the surrounding community, people who were recognized, greeted, and cared for by name rather than treated as anonymous cases. Many staff members formed real, lasting bonds with the people they cared for, and by numerous accounts, the majority of doctors and employees remained genuinely devoted to their patients even as the institution around them buckled under its own weight. This contradiction is perhaps the most difficult truth about Letchworth Village during this period. It was not simply a story of villains and victims. It was a story of a well-intentioned system stretched so far beyond its original design that even the most caring individual staff members could not compensate for what the institution as a whole had failed to provide. The Fieldstone buildings that once symbolized dignity and reform had become something closer to what they were originally built to replace. And the version of Letchworth Village the public had believed in for decades was about to be challenged directly, not by a photograph slipped quietly into circulation, but by a television camera that refused to look away. Chapter 8: The Last Great Disgrace. Warnings about conditions inside New York state institutions had circulated for years before the public was finally forced to reckon with them. In 1965, United States Senator Robert F. Kennedy toured Willowbrook State School. What he witnessed disturbed him enough that he described the institution afterward as a snake pit, a phrase blunt enough to draw attention on its own. But Kennedy had not been permitted to bring cameras into the buildings during his visit. Without images to accompany his words, his speeches about what he had seen largely failed to generate the outrage or reform they might have otherwise produced. The average citizen had no way to see what Kennedy was describing, and without that, his warnings faded from public attention. That changed in 1972, when a young local newsman named Geraldo Rivera set out to document conditions at Willowbrook for ABC News. Unlike Kennedy, Rivera arrived with a full camera crew, and what his footage captured at Willowbrook shocked viewers who had never been shown anything like it. Rivera's resulting documentary, titled Willowbrook: The Last Great Disgrace, focused primarily on the Staten Island facility. But his investigation did not stop there. Rivera had already observed meaningful progress in the treatment and training of disabled individuals at facilities he visited in California, and that comparison sharpened his assessment of what he found back in New York. His reporting also brought him directly to Letchworth Village, accompanied by Bronx Congressman Mario Biaggi. Understanding that staff would likely be given advance notice and time to clean and dress residents before an official visit, Rivera deliberately arrived 2 hours earlier than expected. What they found inside left Biaggi visibly shaken. He would later describe the conditions he witnessed that day at Letchworth as among the worst he had encountered in his life. Rivera viewed the conditions at both Willowbrook and Letchworth as backward and deeply troubling, evidence that the state's institutional system as a whole had fallen dangerously behind where care for disabled individuals needed to be. When the documentary aired, it did what Kennedy's unaccompanied testimony years earlier could not. It showed the public, directly and unmistakably, residents, many of them children, living in overcrowded, unclean conditions, without consistent access to basic hygiene, clean clothing, or attention to their fundamental needs. The facilities were shown to be severely understaffed, offering little in the way of actual schooling, structured activity, or meaningful engagement for the people living there. For viewers across the country, the footage was impossible to ignore. Rivera framed what he had documented not as the failure of any single institution, but as the predictable result of chronic underfunding combined with a broader societal attitude that treated disabled individuals as fundamentally less deserving of attention and resources. He argued that the potential of the residents he had observed, potential to learn, grow, and live with dignity, was being systematically wasted by a system that had stopped trying to realize it. The public response was immediate and significant. Outrage over the documentary's revelations helped catalyze a wave of reform efforts that would go on to reshape disability services across the entire United States, extending far beyond the specific institutions Rivera had filmed. For the residents actually living at Letchworth Village in 1972, however, the impact of national attention was neither instant nor complete. The institution remained inadequately funded and understaffed in the immediate aftermath of the broadcast, and meaningful change would take years to materialize rather than months. But the expose had accomplished something that decades of internal reports, photographs, and even a United States Senator's testimony had failed to achieve on their own. It had made it impossible for the public, and for the state officials who answered to that public, to continue looking away. The pressure Rivera's reporting generated would not fade quickly, and it would ultimately force New York State to confront a system it had allowed to deteriorate for far too long, setting in motion the long, difficult process of reform that would define the village's final decades. Chapter 9: The Long Goodbye. The years following Geraldo Rivera's broadcast did not bring the kind of swift transformation many viewers might have hoped for. Change at Letchworth Village arrived slowly, unevenly, and only under sustained public pressure. But by the end of the 1970s, that pressure had begun to produce real results. Funding levels for direct care staff were significantly increased, a long overdue acknowledgement that the chronic understaffing documented for decades had been a central driver of the neglect exposed on national television. Alongside these funding increases, the state began genuine efforts to reduce overcrowding and restore some measure of privacy to residents who had spent years crammed into dormitories built for a fraction of their actual population. At the same time, a broader philosophical shift was taking hold, one that extended far beyond Letchworth Village itself. The very model that had once made the village famous, a large, centralized institution housing thousands of residents on a single sprawling campus, was increasingly being questioned by advocates, policymakers, and medical professionals alike. The emerging alternative centered on community-based care, smaller group homes situated within ordinary neighborhoods, designed to integrate disabled individuals into the wider community rather than segregating them onto a separate, self-contained campus. New York's Office for People with Developmental Disabilities began actively pursuing this approach, working to establish group homes as a genuine alternative to institutional placement. This transition did not happen without resistance. As the state attempted to place former Letchworth residents into group homes throughout surrounding communities, it encountered significant opposition from local residents who did not want such facilities established in their neighborhoods. Town hall meetings became forums for these objections, where community members voiced concerns and fears about having group homes nearby. Opposition rooted in the same stigma and unfamiliarity that had shaped attitudes toward disability for generations. Despite this resistance, the movement toward community-based care continued to gain momentum throughout the decade. supported by learning programs Letchworth itself had begun implementing, designed specifically to help residents build the skills necessary for a successful transition into more independent, integrated settings. Beyond formal group homes, the state also expanded what were known as family care placements, arrangements in which residents lived with families in the surrounding community rather than remaining on an institutional campus. Combined with the growth of group homes, these community-based alternatives steadily drew down Letchworth Village's population throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. This decline was not driven solely by policy, however. A significant portion of it resulted from simple attrition, as an aging population of long-term residents, some of whom had lived at the village for decades, gradually passed away, further reducing the number of people still calling Letchworth home. In a sense, the very philosophy that had inspired William Pryor Letchworth to build something better than the almshouses of his era was now being surpassed by an even more progressive vision, one that questioned whether any large centralized institution, however well designed, could ever truly replace life within the broader community. By 1996, the process reached its final conclusion. Letchworth Village officially closed its doors. Its remaining residents were transferred to more modern facilities throughout the county, continuing the transition toward community-based care that had been building momentum for nearly 2 decades. The Fieldstone cottages that had once symbolized a radical new vision for humane care now stood empty, their purpose fulfilled, their era definitively over. What remained was not simply an abandoned campus, but a physical record of nearly a century of American attitudes toward disability, evolving in real time, written into buildings that would soon begin to fall silent. Chapter 10: The Nameless Dead. A short distance from Letchworth Village's main campus, tucked into a forest clearing, off Call Hollow Road in Stony Point, New York, lies a burial ground that tells its own quiet chapter of this story. From 1914 through 1967, residents who died while living at Letchworth Village, and whose remains were never claimed by family, were buried here, hidden from the road by a dense stand of trees. Over the course of more than 5 decades, this clearing became the final resting place for more than 900 people, an entire community of the forgotten, laid to rest just a mile from the campus where they had spent their final years. What makes this cemetery so haunting is not simply its remote location, but the way its dead were marked. Instead of headstones bearing names, dates, or any personal detail, each grave was identified only by a small, T-shaped steel marker stamped with a number. Families were technically permitted to purchase individual headstones for their loved ones at their own expense, yet the overwhelming majority never did. As of recent surveys of the site, most of the graves remain marked only by these same anonymous steel numbers, decades after the people beneath them were laid to rest. An entire population was ultimately buried the same way it had so often been cared for, without a name attached. And yet, this story does not end in erasure. In 2007, a large memorial stone was erected at the entrance to the cemetery, inscribed with a plaque bearing the names of those known to be buried within its grounds. The plaque did not attempt to match specific names to specific numbered graves, an impossible task given how the burial records had been kept, but its presence marked something significant nonetheless, a formal, public acknowledgement that these lives mattered enough to be remembered collectively, even if the details of each individual life could no longer be fully restored. That act of remembrance has not remained confined to a single stone dedication ceremony. In the years since, members of the surrounding community have continued visiting the cemetery, particularly the graves believed to belong to children, leaving behind small stones, flowers, and toys as simple acts of tribute. Remarkably, despite the isolation of the site, very few of these markers or memorials have ever been vandalized. Instead, the cemetery has become something closer to a place of ongoing, informal pilgrimage, tended not by the state that once ran the institution, but by ordinary people who felt a responsibility to remember what officials had been content to leave nameless. Today, the burial ground is owned and maintained by the town of Stony Point, supported by volunteers from the local community who continue this same steady work of upkeep and remembrance. A second, newer cemetery was established in 1967, located near Mount Ivy Road in Thiels, and it continued to serve as a burial site in the years that followed. Importantly, the earlier graves in the original forest cemetery were never relocated. The 900 or more people buried there before 1967 remain exactly where they were laid to rest, their numbered markers standing in the same forest clearing they have occupied for decades. There is something meaningful in the fact that this particular piece of Letchworth Village's legacy did not require a documentary crew, congressional investigation, or national scandal to bring it back into public awareness. It required only people willing to walk into a forest clearing, read a number, and choose to remember that a life had been attached to it. In a story defined by institutions that so often failed to see the individuals in their care, this small, ongoing act of remembrance stands as one of the few places where that failure has been corrected. Chapter 11. Ruins and Rumors. In the years since its closure in 1996, Letchworth Village has led a strange double life. Some of its buildings were given genuine second acts, repurposed for practical, everyday use by the surrounding towns. Others were left standing exactly as they were on the day the last residents departed, slowly surrendering to weather, time, and the people who came looking for them. The towns of Haverstraw and Stony Point purchased significant portions of the former campus, transforming sections of it into the Philip J. Rotella and Patriot Hills golf courses, along with the Veterans Memorial Park. Several of the original Fieldstone buildings found new institutional purposes as well, converted into what is now Fieldstone Middle School, Willow Grove Middle School, and the Stony Point Justice Court. Not every structure found this kind of continued use. A roughly 18-acre portion of the property still holds 8 buildings constructed between 1929 and 1952. 3 have been renovated and remain in active use, but the other 5 still sit vacant, and it is those 5 that have suffered the particular kind of decay that comes with true abandonment: broken windows, collapsing interiors, and extensive vandalism, including confirmed cases of arson that have gutted portions of the campus entirely. Multiple proposals have surfaced over the years to redevelop this remaining land. In 2004, a plan emerged to demolish much of what remained and construct a 450-unit condominium development on the site, a proposal that ultimately never moved forward. Later, around 2009, a more ambitious plan proposed building a stadium complex complete with hotels, conference center, and shopping mall. That plan also collapsed, undone in part by local resistance from residents unwilling to risk losing the Little League fields located within the existing Veterans Memorial Park. A community survey conducted in 2003 had found that roughly 71% of respondents supported some form of partnership between the town and private developers. Yet, translating that general support into an actual approved project has proven far more difficult in practice. What remains today is a landscape defined by contrast. On one side of the property, children attending middle school classes in buildings with genuine historical weight behind them, and on the other, crumbling dormitories reclaimed by vegetation, their windows broken, walls marked by decades of graffiti and neglect. This contrast has made Letchworth Village something of a magnet for a very different kind of visitor than it once received. The site has drawn urban explorers and photographers documenting its decay, along with paranormal investigators seeking evidence of something less tangible. The Travel Channel series, Ghost Adventures, filmed an episode exploring the abandoned campus, which originally aired in October of 2011. The site has also appeared in popular fiction, including a Season 3 episode of the television series Elementary, titled The Female of the Species, which aired in February of 2015. There is an uncomfortable irony sitting at the center of this modern chapter. An institution originally built to remove stigma from disability, to replace fear and mystery with structure and dignity, has become, in its abandoned state, a destination defined almost entirely by fear and mystery. The very buildings designed to feel like a peaceful American town now serve as backdrops for ghost stories. Ironic given that the actual history contained within their walls needs no embellishment to disturb. The real story of what happened inside these buildings is unsettling enough on its own. It does not require ghosts. It only requires remembering. Chapter 12. the price of a cure. Letchworth Village resists a simple verdict. It was not a hoax dressed up as compassion, and it was not the humane triumph its founders imagined either. It was something harder to categorize, a genuinely radical act of empathy, built by a man who looked at the almshouses of his era and refused to accept that cruelty was the only option, that gradually absorbed the very assumptions it was meant to overturn. The Fieldstone cottages were real. The vocational workshops, farmland, toys sold each Christmas, all of it reflected a sincere belief that disabled people deserved more than a locked ward. And within that same institution, 20 children were given an experimental vaccine by doctors who never had to ask their permission, because the law of their era did not require anyone to ask. That contradiction is the story. A vaccine trial conducted without consent helped move the world closer to defeating a disease that had terrorized parents for generations. The same institution that produced that unsettling fact also produced decades of documented neglect, overcrowding, and abuse, conditions that persisted for years after they were first noticed, because the people living with them had so little power to demand change on their own behalf. But this is not where the story ends. What happened at Letchworth Village did not simply fade into history unaddressed. The outrage that followed Geraldo Rivera's 1972 broadcast helped drive reforms that reshaped disability services across the entire country. The absence of consent that defined the 1950 polio trial became part of a larger reckoning that produced the National Research Act and the modern framework of informed consent that now governs human research in the United States. Protections that exist specifically because institutions like this one demonstrated what happens without them. Letchworth Village closed in 1996, not because it was forgotten, but because the country had finally decided that its residents deserved something better than what any institution of that scale could offer. And in the forest clearing off Call Hollow Road, that same instinct toward accountability continues in its own quiet way. The 2007 memorial stone did not restore individual names to the more than 900 numbered graves surrounding it, but it stood as a public acknowledgement that these lives had mattered and that erasure was not the final word. Visitors still leave small stones and flowers at those markers today, an ongoing, voluntary act of remembrance that no state agency ever required of them. Letchworth Village's legacy is not simply a warning, it is also proof that institutions built on good intentions can fail the very people they were meant to protect, and that recognizing that failure, however delayed and incomplete, can still lead somewhere meaningful. Nearly a century after its gates first opened, the story of Letchworth Village endures not because of the ghosts said to wander its abandoned halls, but because of the real, complicated, deeply human history contained within them. One in which children who were never given a voice ultimately helped change how an entire country understood the difference between what the law permits and what human dignity actually requires.